Assalamualaikum friends, I am Umama and today we will be studying the major three fossae of the skull. Cranial fossae, anterior fossa, middle fossa and posterior fossa. When you remove a skull cap, also called as calvarium or skull vault, you see the inferior of the base of the skull. At inferior of the base of the skull are the three fossae. Anterior is the anterior cranial fossa, medially is the middle cranial fossa, and posteriorly is the posterior cranial fossa. The anterior cranial fossa loads the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. The middle cranial fossa loads the temporal lobe of cerebral hemisphere, while the posterior cranial fossa loads the occipital lobe of cerebral hemisphere. The shallowest of the all cranial fossa is the anterior cranial fossa. Intermediate is the middle cranial fossa, while the largest and deepest fossa is the posterior cranial fossa. Today we are going to discuss each of these fossae one by one in detail. The anterior cranial fossa, as I discussed earlier, lodges the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. It is bounded anteriorly by the inner surface of the frontal bone and posteriorly by the lesser wing of sphenoid. The anterior cranial fossa is separated from the middle cranial fossa through the lesser wing of sphenoid. The middle cranial fossa is separated from the posterior cranial fossa through the patellar part of temporal bone. Here is the anterior cranial fossa. Anteriorly is the frontal bone. Posteriorly is the lesser wing of sphenoid. Medially is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone has a plate and a projection. The plate is called the cribriform plate and a projection is called crista galli. The cribriform plate has small perforations for the olfactory nerves. The ethmoid bone supports the olfactory bulb. The olfactory nerve is for the sense of smell. With the crista galli and frontal crest attaches the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri is the dorsal septa or dorsal fold. Highlighted in green is the cribriform plate of ethmoid. Passing through these perforations are the olfactory nerves, which receive the sense of smell and is perceived by the olfactory bulb. The projection of ethmoid bone is called as crista galli. With the frontal crest and crista galli attaches the dorsal septa or dorsal fold. This is a sphenoid bone, which is a butterfly-shaped structure. It has a lesser wing of sphenoid and a greater wing of sphenoid. Medially, the lesser wing of sphenoid forms the two processes. That processes are called as the anterior clinoid processes. These processes are for the attachment of the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli is also a dural septa, which makes the roof for the posterior cranial fossa. Medially, the lesser wing of sphenoid forms the anterior clinoid processes, which is the site for the attachment of the tentorium cerebelli. This is the tentorium cerebelli, forming the roof for the posterior cranial fossa. It separates the occipital lobe from the cerebellum below. The cerebellum is also called as the little heart of the brain. Middle cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa has a central, raised body and a lateral expanded body. The central raised body is formed by the body of the sphenoid, while the lateral expanded body is formed by the parietal temporal bone and greater wing of sphenoid. This middle cranial fossa loads the temporal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. It is separated from the posterior cranial fossa through the petrous part of temporal bone. This is the greater wing of sphenoid. Here is the sulcus chiasmatis. Below the sulcus chiasmatis is an elevation called the tuberculum sili. Below that tuberculum sili is a depression, as you can see over here. This depression is called as sella turcica. The important thing about sella turcica is that it loads the pituitary gland, or you may say the pituitary gland is above this sella turcica. The roof for the pituitary gland is the diaphragma sella. The diaphragma sella is also a dural septa or dural fold. Posterior to the sella turcica is dorsum seli, which is a raised elevation. Anteriorly, the dorsum seli form two processes called the posterior clinoid processes. This is all about the body of the sphenoid. Openings in the middle cranial fossa. The first one you can see anteriorly is the optic canal. This optic canal lies between the lesser wing of sphenoid and body of sphenoid. From this optic canal, optic nerve and ophthalmic artery passes through. Between the lesser and greater wing of sphenoid, here you see the superior orbital fissure. Vessels that passes through the superior orbital fissure are lacrimal, frontal, trochlear, oculomotor, nasociliary, abducens, and superior ophthalmic vein. This is a trick for remembering the vessels that passes through the superior orbital fissure, left on as ophthalmic vein. So the lacrimal, frontal, trochlear, oculomotor, nasociliary, abducens, superior ophthalmic vein passes through the superior orbital fissure. Posterior to the superior orbital fissure lies the foramen rotundum, as rotundum means round in shape. From this foramen rotundum, maxillary nerve passes from the trigeminal ganglion to the pterygopalatine fossa. Posterior lateral to the foramen rotundum lies the foramen ovale. From the foramen ovale lies the mandibular nerve. Posterior lateral to the foramen ovale is the foramen spinosum, and the middle meningeal artery passes through this foramen spinosum. One thing that must be remembered is that the foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, and the foramen rotundum, the petrous part of a temporal bone, all of them pierces the greater wing of sphenoid. That opening is called as the foramen lacerum. Foramen lacerum is an irregular opening. At the side of this foramen lacerum is a carotid canal. From this carotid canal, carotid artery passes through. Pterion. This pterion is the region where the frontal, parietal, temporal, and sphenoid bone joins. This is the thinnest area on the lateral view, or you may say the thinnest area in the skull. From here, the best and largest fossa of all the cranial fossa is the posterior cranial fossa. At this side, the anteriorly it is bounded by the petrous part of temporal bone of the head, and posteriorly by the inner surface of the occipital bone. Centrally, you see the foramen magnum, which is a large opening. From this foramen magnum, parts of the hindbrain, the medulla oblongata, passes through. At the side of this opening is a canal called the hypoglossal canal. From this hypoglossal canal, hypoglossal nerve passes through. At the upper border of the condylar part and the lower border of the pectus part of temporal bone is an opening called the jugular foramen. This is the basilar part of occipital bone. The basilar part of occipital bone, condylar part, and the squamous part of occipital bone forms the floor for the posterior cranial fossa, while the roof is formed by the tentorium cerebelli, which is a dural septa or dural fold. Here is a protuberance called the internal occipital protuberance. At the side of this protuberance are two grooves. These grooves are for the transverse sinuses, the right transverse sinus and the left transverse sinus. Posterior to the foramen magnum is the internal occipital crest. This internal occipital crest is for the attachment of the falx cerebelli. The roof of the posterior cranial fossa is formed by the tentorium cerebelli, which is a dural septa or dural fold. Below this tentorium cerebelli is cerebellum, which is also called as little heart of the brain. Above this tentorium cerebelli is occipital lobe. So the posterior cranial fossa loads the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the basilar part of occipital bone. The basilar, condylar and squamous part of occipital bone forms the floor for the posterior cranial fossa. This is the external occipital protuberance. These are the two knuckle lines, the superior knuckle line and the inferior knuckle line. Opening in the posterior cranial fossa, the foramen magnum, which transmits the medulla oblongata of the hindbrain, the hypoglossal canal, which transmits the hypoglossal nerve, and the jugular foramen, from which inferior petrosal sinus, 3 cranial nerves, and the sigmoid sinus passes through. Here is the jugular foramen. From anterior to posterior, the nerves or sinuses that passes through are the inferior petrosal sinus, 9th, 10th and 11th nerve, and the sigmoid sinus. The glossopharyngeal, vagus and accessory nerve are the cranial nerves. Subscribe now if you like my video. Thanks for watching.